The day I found my father's watch box empty, I didn't think about the watch first. I thought about my father's hands. He used to wind that watch every morning at the kitchen table, the same 3 turns, like it was a small prayer he didn't want anyone to notice him saying. When he died, that watch was the only thing of his I asked for. Not the house, not the firm he'd spent 30 years building. Just the watch, sitting in its scuffed leather box on the top shelf of our bedroom closet, wound every Sunday out of habit I couldn't explain to anyone, including myself. That Sunday, the box was there, the watch wasn't. I stood in that closet for a long time, turning the empty box over in my hands, like the weight of it might come back if I just waited long enough. Then I went downstairs and asked my wife if she'd seen it. She didn't look up from the dishes. She said, "I sold it, Nathan," like she was telling me she'd returned a sweater. I want to tell you I asked why right away. I didn't. For a second, I just stood there, waiting for the rest of the sentence. The part where she'd say she was joking, or that it was being cleaned, or anything except what she'd actually said. The rest of the sentence never came. What came instead, 3 weeks later, was a name I'd never heard in my life, and a version of my father I didn't recognize. I remember the sound the empty box made when I set it back down on the dresser. A small, hollow click, like a door shutting on a room I hadn't known existed in my own marriage. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should call someone, the way you'd report a burglary, before realizing there was no one to call, because the person who'd taken it hadn't broken in. She'd been sleeping beside me every night since. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Nathan Whitaker. I'm 37. I practice family and corporate law, and until that Sunday morning, I would have told you my marriage to Emma was the steadiest thing in my life. Steadier than my career, steadier than my relationship with my own mother-in-law, Marjorie, who has never once let me forget she thinks her daughter married beneath her. What I didn't know yet was that my wife hadn't sold that watch for money we needed. She'd sold it to make a problem disappear. A problem with a name, a face, and a claim on my father that went back further than my marriage, further than my law career, all the way back to a version of my father I'd spent my whole life believing was a good man who never once cut a corner. 3 questions sat with me that whole week. Why would Emma trade away the one object I treasured instead of simply asking me for money? We'd never had money we couldn't discuss openly, not once, not even in our leanest years right after law school. Who was the person she was protecting me from, and why did protecting me require deceiving me first? And what, exactly, had my father done? A man I'd spent 37 years believing was the most honest person I'd ever know, that was still costing someone else, quietly, decades after his funeral. I want to be honest with you about something before I tell you the rest of this. I am a lawyer. I have spent 12 years building a career on the idea that the truth, however uncomfortable, is always better excavated than buried. And yet the first 3 days after I found that pawn ticket, I did nothing. I went to work. I coached Silas's Saturday practice. I let Emma believe I hadn't found it, because some part of me was afraid that whatever I uncovered would cost me something I wasn't ready to lose. Not just my father's good name, but the last uncomplicated thing I had left of him. My father, Franklin Whitaker, built his career the hard way. He grew up outside Pittsburgh, the son of a steelworker, and clawed his way through night law school while working days at a freight yard. By the time I was born, he'd made partner at a small firm downtown, and by the time I was in high school, he and his old law school friend, Ivan Kern, had put both their names on the door. Whitaker and Kern, a firm my father ran with a kind of quiet, old-fashioned integrity that I built my entire idea of manhood around. He believed a handshake meant something. He believed you paid your debts, especially the ones nobody was watching you pay. He gave me that watch on the day I passed the bar exam, a slim gold-cased piece from the 1960s, engraved on the inside of the case back with 4 words, "Always time for family." He told me a man could lose almost everything and still be whole, as long as he never lost his word. I believed him completely, and for years, nothing challenged that belief. Emma and I built our life around that same idea. We married young, bought a house 20 minutes from Marjorie in the same Pittsburgh suburb I'd grown up in, and had Silas and then Hazel 2 years apart. Emma manages the books for a chain of dental practices, careful with money in a way that used to make me tease her. She balances our checkbook to the penny, keeps a spreadsheet for the kids' college funds updated to the dollar, and has never, not once in 12 years of marriage, made a financial decision without walking me through it first, down to the smallest impulse purchase at the grocery store. That precision was part of why I fell for her in the first place. My father used to say that the people worth marrying are the ones who make chaos feel manageable just by being in the room, and Emma had always been exactly that kind of steady presence. The one who remembered which of Silas's friends had a peanut allergy, who could talk Marjorie down from a holiday dinner meltdown with a single calm sentence, who never once, in over a decade, gave me a reason to wonder what she wasn't telling me, which is exactly why the 6 weeks before that Sunday morning felt, in hindsight, like watching a familiar road quietly rearrange itself while I wasn't paying attention. Emma had started taking calls in the garage with the door shut. She'd stopped sleeping past 5, and I'd catch her some mornings sitting at the kitchen table with a shoebox of my father's old letters that used to live untouched in the hall closet, reading them like she was searching for something specific. When I asked what she was looking for, she said she just missed him. I let that answer sit, because grief doesn't always make sense, and I didn't think there was anything underneath it. There was a stranger too, a man in a gray sedan who I noticed twice, parked across from our house at odd hours, always gone by the time I got close enough to place his face. Emma said she hadn't seen him. I believed her, the same easy way I believed everything she told me back then. Marjorie had also been strange that month, in a way I chalked up at the time to her usual disapproval of me. She's never made a secret of thinking Emma could have married better. A surgeon, she once suggested at Thanksgiving, apropos of nothing, while carving the turkey I'd bought. But that spring, her disapproval had a different texture to it. She started calling Emma more often, hanging up abruptly whenever I walked into a room, and once, when I asked her directly if something was wrong, she looked at me for a long moment, before saying only that some things were better left where they'd been buried the first time. I didn't press her. Silas noticed things too, the way 10-year-olds notice everything and understand almost none of it. He asked me one night, apropos of nothing, why Mom kept looking at Grandpa's old picture on the mantle, like she was mad at him. I told him grief does strange things to people, even years later, and he seemed to accept that. I didn't think, at the time, that I was lying to him. I know now that I was simply repeating a lie I'd already half believed myself. What none of us said out loud, that whole spring, was that something in our house had shifted. A low, constant hum of tension none of us could quite name, the kind you only recognize in hindsight, once you already know exactly what it was building toward. The morning I found the empty watch box, I asked Emma to explain herself properly, not just the 4 words she'd given me over the dishes. She dried her hands slowly, like she was buying time, and told me she'd taken the watch to a jeweler on the north side for a routine cleaning, and the shop had made her an offer she couldn't turn down. Enough to cover an unexpected bill from Hazel's orthodontist. I wanted, badly, to accept that. It was a clean, boring, forgettable explanation, and for about 4 hours, I did accept it. I even repeated the story to myself in the car, on the way to the office, the way you rehearse a version of events you're hoping will hold up, if you say it enough times. A watch for a dental bill. Strange that she hadn't asked me first, but not the kind of thing that ends a marriage. By lunch, I'd almost talked myself into being annoyed rather than afraid, which in hindsight was exactly what I think she was hoping I'd do. Then Hazel asked me at dinner, entirely without guile, why her teeth still hurt if her braces were already paid for. I remember setting my fork down very carefully. I asked Emma, just as carefully, which orthodontist she'd used, and she named a practice I'd never heard of, in a part of town neither of us had any reason to visit. When I offered to call and confirm the bill myself, she told me not to bother her about it, in a tone she has never once used with me in 12 years. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 1 in the morning, I went down to hang up her coat, which she'd left over the kitchen chair, and a folded slip of paper slid out of the inside pocket onto the floor. It was a pawn ticket from a shop called Ochoa Vintage and Timepieces on the south side, dated 3 weeks earlier, listing one item: gold pocket watch, engraved caseback, sold outright, not held for redemption. Sold outright, not pawned, not held. Gone, on purpose, to a stranger, for a reason my wife had lied to my face about twice in one day. I stood in my own kitchen at 1 in the morning, holding proof that the woman I trusted more than anyone alive had made a decision about my father's watch, my father's memory, without me, and I had absolutely no idea why. The only thing I knew for certain, standing there in the dark with that slip of paper in my hand, was that whatever she was protecting me from, she'd decided it was worse than the risk of losing my trust to get there, and that frightened me more than any secret itself could have. I didn't confront Emma with the ticket right away. Part of that was strategy. 12 years of practicing law had taught me never to walk into a confrontation with half the facts. And part of it, if I'm honest, was cowardice. As long as I hadn't said the words out loud to her, I could still tell myself there was an explanation waiting on the other side of them that wouldn't change everything. So I drove to the south side the next morning instead, told the office I had a deposition running long, and found Ochoa Vintage and Timepieces wedged between a laundromat and a shuttered diner. The kind of shop that's been on the same corner longer than the buildings around it. The shop smelled like machine oil and old velvet, glass cases lined with pocket watches and wristwatches arranged by decade. The owner, Sylvia Ochoa, remembered the sale the moment I described the engraving. She's run that shop for over 20 years, restoring and reselling estate watches, and she told me that my wife had come in alone on a Tuesday afternoon, pale and shaking, clutching the watch box like it might be taken from her before she'd finished deciding to hand it over. She didn't haggle, Sylvia told me, wiping down a case she'd clearly already wiped down twice that morning. People who need money for something they're ashamed of never haggle. They just want the transaction over before they change their mind. She'd asked for cash on the spot, rather than a fair consignment price, a request Sylvia said told her everything she needed to know about how badly the woman needed the money to disappear, not to help someone, but to make someone go away. Sylvia also told me something I hadn't expected. The watch hadn't stayed in her shop for more than a day. A man had come in that same week, described the exact piece before she'd even pulled it from the case, and bought it back off her at double what she'd paid Emma. The name was Douglas Farrow. I'd never heard it before in my life. That should have been the end of it. A stranger's name. Easily forgotten, except that when I said it out loud in my own kitchen that evening, Marjorie, who happened to be overwatching the kids, went very still over her coffee and told me, quietly, that I needed to let this one go. Nathan, for my own sake and my father's. Quick note before we go further. If this story's already got you hooked, drop a comment letting me know what you think Emma was hiding. It genuinely helps this reach more people who need to hear it. Marjorie wouldn't say more that night. But 2 days later, after Emma left early for a work trip she'd scheduled with unusual suddenness, Marjorie called me into her kitchen and sat me down the way she used to sit Emma down when Emma was a teenager caught in some small lie. She told me she'd known this reckoning was coming since before Silas was even born, that she'd watched my father carry something heavy for 30 years and never once say what it was, not even to my mother. "Your father was a good man, Nathan," she said, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. "I need you to hold on to that before you hear anything else. Whatever you find, don't you let it undo 37 years of knowing him." I asked her what, exactly, I was going to find. She told me that my father's old partner, Harold Farrow, had died in a car accident 30 years ago, driving home from a courthouse loss that had gutted him, and that the story the firm told afterward, a simple, tragic accident, nothing more, had never quite matched the whispers she used to overhear from my father and Ivan when the two of them thought no family was listening. I pressed her for details she didn't have. She told me the only man alive who actually knew what happened that night was Ivan Kern, my father's law partner and oldest friend, who still lived 20 minutes from us and hadn't spoken more than a few words to me since my father's funeral. If you've ever had a spouse make a decision for your own good without telling you, hit that like button before we keep going. I want to know how many of you have been on either side of that. I found Douglas Farrow before I found Ivan. He worked as a shift supervisor at a distribution warehouse outside the city, and when I introduced myself at the end of his shift, waiting by his car in the half-light of the loading dock lot, he didn't look surprised to see me. He looked, if anything, like a man who'd rehearsed this exact moment for years and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. He told me, flatly, leaning against his truck with his arms crossed, that my father had ruined his father's name to save the firm's reputation, that Harold Farrow's death had been quietly buried and mischaracterized by the very men who owed him everything, and that he'd grown up on stories of a father erased twice over, once by the accident itself, and once by the men who'd decided what could and couldn't be said about it afterward. He told me he'd spent 3 months gathering old firm correspondence, insurance filings, and a single unsent letter of his father's, pulled from a storage unit his mother had kept for decades, before finally reaching out to the one person he thought could make things right without dragging the whole story through a courtroom. My wife, not me, because he said he'd read enough about my career to guess I'd fight him instead of listening. He told her, plainly, that either the firm made things right privately, the way it should have been done 30 years ago, or he'd take everything he had to a reporter who'd already expressed interest. Emma, he said, had gone pale, then begged him for time, not to build a defense, but because she needed to understand what she was actually protecting before she decided what to do. She'd come back 3 weeks later with cash from the watch and a promise of more to follow. "I'm not proud of asking a stranger to sell her father-in-law's watch," he told me, looking at the ground rather than at me. "But I'd spent 30 years watching my mother struggle while your father's name stayed clean on a building downtown. I wanted something to finally cost your family what it cost mine. I sat in my car in that warehouse parking lot for a long time before I could make myself drive anywhere. Every version of my father I'd carried since childhood was suddenly sitting next to a version I didn't recognize. A man capable of burying something ugly to protect the only thing he'd built. I didn't know yet which version was closer to true. I left that lot with my hands still shaking, driving straight to Ivan Kern's house, because I needed, before I did anything else, to know exactly what my father had actually done. Ivan Kern is 74 now, retired, living alone in the same brick two-story house he's owned since before I was born. He let me in without a word, like he'd been expecting this visit longer than I'd been expecting to make it, and he sat me down at his kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee neither of us touched. I always thought it would be you asking me this. Someday, he said, before I'd even gotten the question out. I just thought I'd have a few more years. The truth, when it finally came, was both worse and far less monstrous than what Douglas Farrow believed. Harold Farrow had lost a case he should have won, a wrongful termination suit the firm had badly underprepared, and he'd been drinking that night, alone, in a way Ivan said had become a habit no one at the firm wanted to acknowledge out loud. He drove off a bridge on the way home. It was, Ivan swore to me with his hand flat on the table, a genuine accident, confirmed by the coroner's own report at the time. Nothing hidden, nothing altered. What my father had actually covered up wasn't the cause of death. It was what happened after. The firm's malpractice insurer had threatened to deny Harold's family their full life insurance payout, citing his blood alcohol level as evidence of reckless conduct that voided certain clauses in the group policy. My father had gone to the insurer's regional office himself, twice, arguing the clause shouldn't apply to a man's private tragedy on his own time, and had been turned down flat both times. So my father, convinced Harold's widow and young son shouldn't lose their house over one broken night, had quietly rewritten the internal incident report the firm submitted to that insurer, describing road conditions and a mechanical failure that minimized the alcohol finding. He had also personally guaranteed the difference between what the insurer eventually paid and what the family actually needed, siphoning it out of his own savings in small, deniable increments over almost 4 years. It had cost my father nearly everything he'd built in the firm's first decade. He had never told a soul outside Ivan, not even my mother, because what he'd done, however good his reason, was insurance fraud, plain and documented, and he'd spent 30 years afraid it would surface and destroy the very firm he eventually handed down to me. He'd also never told Douglas Farrow's mother the full truth of what he'd sacrificed, because he didn't want it to look like charity, or like guilt he was buying his way out of. So Douglas grew up believing his father's death had been dismissed and mishandled by the very men who owed him everything, when in fact my father had quietly ruined his own financial footing, trying to protect that family in the only way pride would let him. Emma had found the truth in that shoebox of letters, one from my father to Ivan, unsent, apologizing for never being able to say any of this to Harold's family without unraveling his own career. She hadn't sold the watch to bury my father's secret. She'd sold it and started assembling the rest of the money on her own, because she was terrified that if Douglas went to a reporter with half the story, the cover-up half, without the sacrifice half, it would destroy both my father's memory and my standing at my own firm before I ever had the chance to learn the whole truth and make it right myself. Ivan told me, at the end of that long, coffee-cold afternoon, that he'd urged Emma more than once to simply tell me from the start, and that she'd refused every time, insisting she needed to know exactly what she was protecting me from before she decided how much of it I could carry. "She loves you the way your father loved that firm," he said, not unkindly. "Sometimes that kind of love decides things for you before it asks." I went back to Douglas Faro 2 days later, this time with Ivan Kern beside me, and we sat across from him at a diner near the warehouse and told him everything. The actual coroner's findings, the falsified incident report, the money my father had quietly bled out of his own accounts for the better part of a decade to keep his widow afloat. I brought the old, unsent letter with me, in my father's handwriting, and set it on the table without a word, letting Douglas read it himself. I watched 30 years of a specific kind of anger drain out of a man's shoulders in real time. He didn't apologize for the blackmail. I don't think either of us needed him to, but he told me, quietly, that he'd spent his whole life building a story about a father who'd been erased and a Whitaker family who'd erased him, and that the truth, as much as it complicated things, was easier to carry than the version he'd been dragging around since he was 9 years old. There was no lawsuit. There was no reporter. Instead, with Ivan's help, I set up a modest trust in Harold Faro's name, funded partly by the firm, partly by me personally. The settlement my father had always meant to make properly, in daylight, instead of in secret out of fear. Douglas didn't ask for the watch back when I offered to buy it from him. He handed it over without a word, told me it had never really been his to keep, and asked instead for the letter. Emma and I didn't need a courtroom or a headline to find our way back to each other. Just a long night at our kitchen table, the same table where she'd once told me she'd sold the watch in 4 flat words, where she finally told me the rest of it. She said she'd found the letters looking for nothing in particular, that reading them had felt like discovering a second version of my father living quietly inside the first one, and that once Douglas made contact, she genuinely believed she had days, not weeks, to make the problem disappear before it reached me, or my firm, or the children. I told her what I'll tell you now. Protecting someone from a painful truth and protecting them from the truth entirely are not the same thing, and the difference between the two is almost always trust. She agreed, quietly, and told me she understood that now in a way she hadn't 3 weeks earlier, sitting alone with a shoebox of letters and a stranger's phone number, trying to decide how much of someone else's history she had the right to carry by herself. My father's watch sits back in its box on our closet shelf. I wind it every Sunday, same as always, 3 turns, the way he taught me. But I think about it differently now. Not as a symbol of a man who never made a mistake, but as a reminder that even the people who taught us what integrity looks like were carrying their own quiet, complicated compromises the whole time. Marjorie apologized to me, in her own way, a few weeks later, which for Marjorie meant setting a plate of her pot roast in front of me without being asked and saying, almost under her breath, that she supposed I'd turned out all right after all. Silas still asks, occasionally, why Grandpa's watch stopped for those few weeks. And I've told him, honestly, that sometimes the people we love make hard choices trying to protect each other, and that the choice isn't always the right one, even when the love behind it is. Hazel just likes watching me wind it on Sundays. 3 turns, same as her great-grandfather taught her great-grandfather, for all I actually know. If you found out tomorrow that someone you admired most, a parent, a spouse, the person who taught you what integrity even looks like, had hidden a decision exactly like my father's, 1 part sacrifice and 1 part cover-up, would it change how you see them, or would it just make them, finally, all the way human? I've told you a lot of stories from this family over the years, but this one stayed with me longer than most, because it wasn't really about a blackmailer or a pawnshop ticket in the end. It was about how far the people we love will go to spare us a truth they think we can't carry, and whether that kind of protection is really love or just a different, quieter kind of secret keeping. I'd genuinely love to know what you think about Emma's choice here. Was she right to try to shoulder this alone? Or should she have trusted me with it from the very first phone call? Drop a comment and tell me honestly. I read every single one, and this conversation always gets more interesting once you all weigh in. If this story moved you even a little, do me a favor and hit that like button before you go. It tells me these longer, slower burn family stories are worth the time it takes to tell them right. If you know someone who's ever had to decide whether to protect a spouse from a hard truth or hand it to them straight, send this one their way. Make sure you're subscribed and that your notifications are turned on, because the next story in this family's life is already waiting, and you will not want to find out what happens by accident weeks later, the way I usually seem to. Emma still teases me that I'm the last person in this house to notice anything is wrong, which, considering everything I've just told you, might be the most accurate thing anyone in my family has ever said about me. And before you go, tell me one thing in the comments. Where in the world are you watching this from tonight? I always read those, every single time, and it means more than you'd probably guess to know how far these stories travel. From one kitchen table to another, apparently all over the world. Thank you for staying with me through this one. It wasn't an easy story for me to tell, even now, months after living through it, and I'm grateful you were here for it. I'll see you in the next chapter of this life I never quite expected to be living out loud, in front of all of you, one impossible Sunday at a time.